Okay. So I'm Penny Morgan. I'm delighted on behalf to introduce Camille Stevens-Rumann and welcome her on behalf of the White Pine chapter of the Idaho Native Plant Society. Dr. Camille Stevens-Rumann is an assistant professor at Colorado State University and very actively doing research as part of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. I know Camille well because she got her PhD here, earned it at the University of Idaho while teaching multiple courses in fire ecology and fire management. As part of her PhD, she collected field data from all across Idaho, and that led this really innovative analysis and synthesis of combined field data, combined from many studies in Idaho and beyond, working with and leading scientists who conducted those studies. So Camille, thank you for repeating this presentation so that we can record it. You gave it in December 2020, and when you did, there were more than 40 participants, many questions, much discussion. It's our error, and so we doubly thank you for doing this so that we can post a recording, because I think this excellent seminar will be of interest to many. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks for having me. So today I'm going to be talking about tree regeneration, and as we all are experiencing, we are living in a time of changing climate. So a big part of talking about tree regeneration, especially after wildfires, I think, is understanding how these ecosystems are responding to climate change and fires, and what we can expect kind of from these landscapes going forward, because I know we all are very attached to the trees that are there. And when we have big fires, we're worried about whether or not those places are going to return to something that we remember them being. So the first thing I want to talk about is kind of these ideas of resilience and perhaps the mechanisms of conversion that we might see. So the mechanisms that we see when we have these big changes and these different trajectories these forests and ecosystems have. And so the first step of that really is these large wildfires. This is a picture from a fire here in Colorado, the East Troublesome fire that that moved at 6,000 acres an hour overnight this past fall. And it has been in general a crazy fire, not so much in Idaho, but I think that a lot of the West has started to feel kind of some of those pains that Idaho has felt actually for multiple years already, in terms of having these big fires and these big imprints on both the landscape and the people affected by these fires. And these are just some of the statistics I took today, updated for all of 2020, but over 10 million acres burned in 2020 across 58,000 fires. And these are just a couple of pictures from this past year. We had those big fires in California. If we can remember back to last January, there were the big fires in Australia as well that really impacted a lot of their ecosystems. And then, we had those big fires in Oregon and Washington as well. But I think one of the troubling things is that even though these occurrences, these big fires happened, and this was certainly a big fire year, I think in the short record that I looked at, it was one of the biggest fire years. It's not so far out of the normal. We've had several other years in the last 20 that were over 10 million acres burned. So, this is to some degree, perhaps what we should be expecting going forward, these big, to continue to have these big fire years and these ecosystems that we haven't seen burn in hundreds of years, perhaps starting to burn again. So you have this initial fire event, and this is just a little diagram to kind of talk about what we're talking about when we talk about resilience. So, we have this fire event where whether it's a big fire or a small fire, you're going to see some ecosystem change, right? You start off with all these ecosystems being relatively, perhaps those forests that you love, they're older forests, they have mature trees, And those fires are certainly going to change that landscape. If it's resistant, you might see a very minimal change, meaning that, you know, the classic ponderosa pine forest where fires just move through the understory and the overstory remains intact. But if you have a fire like this that is actually high severity, you're going to see quite a bit of change. And the question is, here's a couple examples from some of my field work of some areas that had burned the year before these pictures were taken. And they look pretty different than they probably did the year before. You can see all those standing dead trees, but there still is some green in those pictures. And the question is, you know, are they going to be coming back into a similar ecosystem? Kind of what this green line is showing, this light green line, where we see resilience and these ecosystems coming back, or are we seeing these long-term changes? And so, you know, to give you some pictures of what that might look like, this is Carrie Kemp, another one of Penny's old students in some of her field sites. And, you know, you could see just abundant amount of regeneration. On these sites, it's almost hard to walk through them without stepping on a tree. And so in those places, we probably would expect them to come back to a similar forest, or at least a forested ecosystem. Some examples of some conversions, right? So in the top, these kind of persistent transformations might be something like these two landscapes. This has changed to either a grassland or a shrubland. The picture on the left is from the Yellowstone 1988 fires, and even almost 30 years later, these ecosystems, some of these places have not recovered. You can see the standing dead trees, but it looks like a beautiful grassland now. The picture on the right at the top is a picture from Idaho from a fire in 2007. And if you can kind of see the person in orange there, that's one of my field crew members, you know, standing in a field of head-high shrubs. So we can kind of expect that in that landscape as well, we're going to see some pretty consistent and persistent changes. But we don't know, we can't predict, you know, in the 100-year time frame whether or not these landscapes are going to come back. And I wanted to show this picture as an example of a place that perhaps might come back into a forest similar to what was there before. This is a gamble oak, kind of really extensive resprouting, but underneath, hidden among that gamble oak is a nice little Douglas fir seedling that maybe is getting shaded and might you know, come back with a to be part of the overstory in the long run. So you have these processes of conversion and these ideas of resilience, and there's a few things that precipitate these changes, right? Like I said, you have to have those big fires. And I think when we talk about climate change, one of the big important things is to talk about the scale at which it's changing the fires themselves. So, you know, if you look at this top picture, this is a really large landscape. This is from the Hayman fire in Colorado that has experienced a large wildfire. And a large high severity wildfire. So this area actually has about 18 square miles of high severity patch, meaning that there's hardly any to no living trees within that area. And so that's going to really matter to you if you're a tree trying to establish. It's a lot harder to get into the middle of that large high severity patch. And the conditions that are on that site are, you might experience hotter and drier conditions because you're so exposed compared to an area like this bottom picture, which is certainly within a high severity patch. You can see the trees right in the foreground of that picture are black, but there's still a lot of shading because this is a relatively small patch of high severity surrounded by low severity fire. So you're gonna, those seedlings that are trying to establish and all of those plants that are reestablishing are experiencing really different conditions. So I think it's really important to think about the scale at which we're talking about these changes, because, you know, some openings might be fine and might actually be beneficial for many of those ecosystems, but it's these large landscape conversions that we might be concerned about. So after you lose that overstory, right, you have that big, large landscape. What are the possibilities? What are those possible trajectories? And we've talked a little bit about them. But there's certainly these places, again, that have really abundant regeneration. This picture on the left is from Glacier National Park. And again, you can see at the bottom of the picture, just an abundant amount of tree regeneration coming in among all those standing dead snags. So there is a good likelihood that those ecosystems are going to recover to a forested ecosystem. But then there's lots of different possibilities for ecosystem transitions, right? One example perhaps is just a shifting overstory composition. So you can have, this is a picture from a bark beetle outbreak in Wyoming of spruce beetle, but you could have these kind of recoveries from fires too, where you lose one of the species, but it still remains a forest. And I think that's important to acknowledge that you're still seeing some ecosystem change, right? You know, if you really like larch or a white bark pine and suddenly those aren't a part of that system anymore, that's going to be really, that could potentially have large cascading effects on those, you know, whole ecosystem properties if you see these ecosystem shifts, even if it remains a forest. There's also the possibility of transitions from conifer to deciduous forest. So this is a site that burned in 2018. And even 1 year later, you can see, you know, abundant amounts of resprouting starting to happen. We had both gamble oak and aspen coming back. And so we can expect that these landscapes will probably have, you know, some tree cover in the future. But this overstory, when it burned, was a really mixed conifer forest with a more minor component of aspen. And so it may transition back to a conifer forest in the very long term, but in the short term, you could see these, you know, somewhat persistent changes to deciduous forests. And then I think the one that a lot of people are concerned about and that we worry about is this transition from a forest of some kind to a non-forest. And, you know, I talked about this picture on the left, and the picture on the right is from here in Colorado. And I kind of like it because this is another co-author of ours, Monica Rother, looking up at the trees at the top of the hillside, kind of waving up to them, because there's not very much tree regeneration on that site, but hopefully up closer to those living trees above her, there would be. But, you know, we see these kind of landscape scale changes of a loss of forest. And this has a lot of, you know, people concerned, whether that's because you're worried about carbon accounting or because you just love trees and the ecosystems that are in those places. We're concerned about these transitions. So I think it's important to talk about what kind of factors drive ecosystem changes. And this was a you know, really driving question for a lot of the work that Penny and I did of, you know, how are these ecosystems recovering, and what can we expect? What can we expect going forward? So we did both an analysis of, you know, across a really large data set, but we also did a review. And one of the things that really came out strongly across a lot of literature that's out there is that distance to live trees, or basically a seed source, right? You have to have seeds coming from somewhere if you want trees to reestablish. And so the distance you are from a living tree really matters. And in a lot of cases, it's because a lot of our conifer trees are just not very good dispersers. There are exceptions to this, certainly. You know, lodgepole does well at regenerating from dead trees right after a fire because of their serotinous cones. And other species like white bark pine or limber pine might be colonizing areas through bird dispersed seeds. And so the distances that they can be from a living tree might extend further into that burn landscape or that high severity patch. But many conifers, really, we're looking at about 100 meters or less that we see a significant amount of tree regeneration coming in. So, you know, if you're talking about, again, this is another picture from the Hayman fire, an 18 square mile high severity patch, it's going to take, you know, centuries to gradually infill that whole thing, even if regeneration is naturally could occur. Another factor that we found that was really important across the literature was repeated disturbances. And you could think about these in a couple different ways. One is repeated fires. So as you have, multiple fires in a short time period, even if you had great regeneration after the first fire, a lot of times those trees haven't matured enough to reestablish after the second fire. And this picture on the right here is an example of a landscape from in a boreal forest in Canada, where we see that happening. Boreal forests tend to in general regenerate really well and reestablish really quickly after a fire, but after the second fire, there really isn't that seed stock and seed availability for a subsequent fire or a subsequent reestablishment. We also see that with bark beetle outbreaks and fire. This across the literature, this is a little bit more mixed, but certainly there has the potential to lose your seed source from the bark beetle outbreak, and then you have fire, which cuts out the rest of the overstory, leaving very few trees to repopulate. And then drought and fire, right? Those trees are already weakened. Perhaps they're not producing as many cones or as many viable seeds. And that coupled with fire might also result in less regeneration. Here's another picture of just an area, you can really see this is a fire about 10 years after the first fire. And there was a bunch of regeneration there, but none of those trees are old enough to either resist the fire or have cones to repopulate that area. So we might not see that amount of abundant regeneration in the future. And these areas are also really hard to fight fires in, because you can see all those down fuels. There's lots of snags in the background. So there's not much you can do to stop those fires as they move through those types of stands. And then we've talked about how climate is perhaps influencing fires themselves through these bigger fire years and there's more area burned. But we also have climatic constraints on regeneration. And this is just a figure from one paper by Kimberly Davis et al. And, in this case, we have these, prior to 2000, they found that there was a lot of years where the climate was conducive to trees reestablishing. So there were multiple time periods where you had a high probability of having trees established. Whereas after 2000, you can kind of see these fluctuations taper off, because the climate has become more and more, it has become hotter and drier, making them less conducive to tree reestablishment. And we see this across a lot of literature that we looked at. And this is one of those growing fields that feel like, as we were writing the review, and as even in the last couple months, I would say there's been more and more papers out on this phenomenon that the climate is becoming less favorable for tree regeneration. And so this is saying, basically, even if you have all those other conditions, right, you have enough time for those trees to reestablish, you have a seed source nearby, that you may not see trees coming back, even if everything else, all the other conditions were met. And then there's things that we can kind of talk about in terms of reinforcing feedbacks. And so this is kind of thinking about, this picture that I showed before of this shrubland. In this area, right, or you could think about perhaps even in California, where you have these really burnable, flammable shrubs. If you have this ecosystem where we're seeing, a somewhat persistent change, but maybe somewhere in that understory or below all those shrubs, there's some tree regeneration coming back in. These shrubs are often more flammable than the forest that was there before, meaning that these landscapes are more likely to burn again. So even, and that kind of reinforces this ecosystem change. You can kind of think about it. Another example would be cheatgrass, where you have this continuous cheatgrass field, and maybe some sagebrush is starting to come back into it a little bit after 5 or 10 years, but those systems are ready to burn again after 1 to 2. And so the likelihood of that being a persistent change because of those feedbacks of vegetation and fire can be pretty long-lived and long-lasting. So just to give, zoom in on a couple of the study that Penny mentioned, and give you some examples of kind of what we're seeing in Idaho and Montana. This was one of the studies that we did, which kind of synthesized a lot of the data from the Northern Rockies and kind of Northern Colorado. And this was actually, really big effort by multiple PhD and master's students and field crews, where we measured over 62,000 seedlings as a part of this data set across 1,400 sites. And one of the big things that we noticed is that, again, that kind of year 2000 was a really big changing point for how these ecosystems were recovering. So before 2000, we see, if you look at the bar that's above the zero in both of these graphs, this is indicating sites that didn't have a single tree on them. And before 2000, we still had some sites that had no tree regeneration, but it was about 17%, meaning that only about 17% of the landscape was not regenerating before 2000. Whereas after 2000, this switches to almost 33%. So it about doubles the amount of area that is not regenerating. And you can see that here with this much larger graph or bar above zero. And this is concerning because this isn't something that we're predicting, right? This is not something that we're not talking about how climate change is going to change these landscapes in the future, but already happening across these landscapes. And the factors for this most prominently were that contributed to these changes were those distance to seed source. And again, as you see these larger fires with larger high severity patches, you may have more of the landscape that's really far from a seed source. And this is a picture of Eva out on some of the sites that we studied in central Idaho. And then average site climate was really important, meaning that those sites that had, that in general were, had lower, were hotter and drier in general, were less likely to regenerate. So you can kind of think about this as those lower elevation, lower on the mountain ecosystems that are already kind of at the edge of their tolerance or their ability to be forests. And with these fires, they're really precipitating that change and where that ecotone boundary is. Meaning that those higher elevation moisture forests tended to have at least some regeneration on them. I wanted to also give the caveat that this isn't, again, happening to all species and happening everywhere. So this is just from the data from the greater Yellowstone area. And again, this is, it's missing the top axis, but the three graphs on the left are from before 2000, and the three bars on the right are after 2000. And you can see that, again, before 2000, there still are some places that aren't regenerating at all. Those are the black parts of the graph. But after 2000, we see quite a big increase in the number of sites in dry mixed conifer and moist mixed conifer that don't have any tree regeneration coming back. But I think what's also interesting is that these lodgepole pine forests, again, those ones that kind of love fire and are pretty good at regenerating right after a fire, we're not seeing this climate effect, at least not yet on these sites, meaning that they're still doing fine with these large fires. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge, again, that this isn't happening everywhere, and there still are plenty of places that are regenerating. And in fact, some of these lodgepole pine sites that did have lots of presence of seedlings. We had over 2 million trees per hectare, or about 600,000 trees per acre. So that's just, a carpet of 2-inch trees. So it's important to remember that there are some places that are doing really well. So I think we also need to, address this idea of what we can expect going forward. Is this just what's happened between 2000 and when we, wrote up this paper a couple of years ago? Is this something we can we would expect to continue to happen. And, you know, I think there's been a lot of really interesting research that's come out even this past year in 2020, kind of about this and the factors that might be really important. This picture on the right is from a sequoia stand, right? That historically would have been very resistant to fire, and you can see that there aren't any living trees in that picture. And there was a really interesting paper that came out in 2020 that actually showed not only has the area burned increased, but the area burned at high severity has increased. And that's really important and potentially concerning when we're talking about trees coming back into those landscapes again, right? If you need a tree to be nearby to reestablish, if those high severity areas are bigger and more, there's potential for that to be of a concern. And there's lots of future projections that this is going to continue to increase. So, you know, these are just different studies from different areas across North America, but in all cases, there's projections that we're going to see a decrease in the amount of forested area, in part because of fires and climate change across these landscapes. You know, for example, in the top right here in the Intermountain West, there's approximation that we're going to lose about 16% of ponderosa pine and 10% of Douglas fir in a 2 degrees C warming scenario. And again, those are kind of those hot and dry elevation, hot and dry forest types, those lower elevation forests. But really, this is a pattern that we're seeing all over and really worldwide, even though what I focused on here was just the Western North America. And so we can expect that this is probably this pattern of seeing these forest conversions to something other than a forest might be likely. So then the question is, what do we do? How do we mitigate these risks? How do we manage these increasingly burnable landscapes? And, you know, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're not going to stop all fires, right? We can have increase the number of fire crews we have by the thousands, and we still won't be able to stop all fires. These ecosystems are adapted to fire and they're burnable, you know, so we're not going to stop it altogether. So what do we do instead? And I think one of the big things is trying to mitigate the creation of those large high severity patches. We can't do a whole lot about stopping the progression of climate change in the short term, but we can help mitigate those other factors that are contributing to these change in ecosystems. And a lot of this goes to how we manage fires currently, but also how we manage those post-fire landscapes. If we want trees to be there, how do we make sure that they are, and what should we do? So to that first point, this is a quote that Penny always shared with us, is that fire is a bad master, but a good servant. And I think that's so true. You know, we in the United States effectively suppress 98% of fires that start. So those ones that make the news that you all hear about are only the 2% of fires that get out of control. But that means that those other 98% are burning at times that are during periods of time that they could be managed more effectively and used as a servant. And so we need to think about them. And I think we need to think about how, not just how we're managing fires and how we can effectively change our management strategies, but how, you know, many Indigenous people have managed and influenced these landscapes through fire in the past. Because I think there's a lot we can learn about how to use and manage fire into the future with that knowledge. But then thinking about that, again, that post-fire times, what options do we have after that fire happens? Because there's many, you know, there's 10 million new acres that are in that post-fire state right now from 2020. And I think it really, one of the critical things that we took away from many of our conversations with managers and other scientists is that we need to be thinking about climate change with our post-fire management strategies in a much more inclusive way. And I think one of those things, this is just one framework for thinking about it. And this is a RAD framework where you can either resist that change by promoting, trying to promote those species that perhaps already are there. There's accepting change, where maybe there's places at those lowest elevations that no matter what you do, no matter how many trees you plant, you may not get trees back, or the trees' survival in those landscapes. And so maybe those places are great places to accept that. How can you facilitate them being really great rangelands and healthy and productive rangelands rather than a forest? And then there's places that perhaps we want to direct change because we really value, have the cultural, human, or ecological value of wanting a forest to be there, or a specific ecosystem to be there. But in order to do that, we have to think really creatively about how a forest could continue to be there. And this could involve things like selecting from more drought tolerant genetic stock of species. That this gets into the realm of assisted migration, whether or not we should be moving species. And there's certainly lots of positives and negatives about that. But I think if we really are assigning a lot of value to these places continuing to be forests, we're going to have to be creative about how we make that happen. And Penny and I did a lot of workshops with various managers on kind of these ideas, and created a decision tree that included climate change a little bit better, because there's lots of when you have limited resources but lots of potential acres to reforest, you have a little bit more leeway on where and how to do it. And so I think that that's a great place for us to start experimenting in these burned landscapes, so that we can best use those limited resources where they're going to be the most effective into the future. And again, I think that all goes to planting trees for future tree regeneration and future forests, rather than trying to think about the reestablishment of those forests that were here in our lifetime. And one great example that I like to, that I've recently become aware of, that I like to point to, is there are places here in Colorado that are at 10,000 feet in elevation that are spruce fir dominated forests, but there is some remnant wood and forests and logs still on the landscape that were established in the year 1000, so 1,000 years ago. And those are all ponderosa pine trees. So the trees that we would normally expect to see at much lower elevations were there 1,000 years ago, meaning that maybe that's the kind of forest type we should be targeting as we experience these hotter and drier conditions. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Camille, for that really excellent presentation. I love the pictures that I know you've taken yourself from your experiences out on the landscape, and the beautiful pictures and intelligent graphics you've given us. We did get many questions when you gave this in December to the White Pine chapter of the Idaho Native Plant Society, and so I wanted to include some of those questions. So the first one, many people have called for more fire, not less, particularly if those fires or much of that area is burning under less extreme weather conditions. What do you think of that idea?
I think absolutely. I think we're still in many places in a fire deficit, meaning we haven't had enough fire to get kind of back to the way these ecosystems burned, either the frequency or the interval, prior to fire suppression and European settlement. And so I think, again, it goes back to that fire being a bad master, but a good servant. If we can have more landscape burning under less extreme conditions, then we're less likely to have these really large high severity patches that then become more difficult for reestablishment.
And how would that be accomplished? Do we just let them burn? What do you?
Yeah, I mean, never in the United States do we just let fires burn. These are all like we do. There is. It's gone through many iterations in terms of the language, but whether we call it wildfire use or wildfires for resource benefit, we have these fires that are allowed to burn under less extreme conditions, and usually they're still managed. There's still people there, kind of corralling them, making sure that they don't go to places that we don't want them to be, but allowing them to kind of create that more mosaic landscape. And in many ways, that reduces firefighter danger, because you're not, right next to those flames, and you're not trying to go deal with these extreme conditions. They're burning under much less extreme conditions, and they're able to kind of hold and corral that fire at points that make sense rather than right where the fire is burning, which again decreases that firefighter risk. So there's lots of benefits to using fire.
Okay. And prescribed fires as well?
Yeah, I think absolutely. There's a couple I think hard to overcome issues with prescribed fire, and that's one of those is just that those take a lot of planning and work beforehand, that and really end up being only a couple hundred acres. Usually, is those are kind of large, even for prescribed fires to be a couple hundred acres. And so it's a lot harder to treat large landscapes through prescribed fire alone, whereas we could use wildfire and get 1,000 or a couple thousand acres treated in a single incident, which would be difficult for a prescribed fire. And then the other thing, from a plant perspective, if we're having fires burn so far out of the fire season, like in late fall or really early spring, we might have other ecological effects that we haven't fully understood or appreciated yet, but it is a good tool that we need to use.
Okay. A lot of our audience is interested in the understory vegetation, the shrubs and grasses, and especially the wildflowers. And it seems like fewer trees would actually potentially increase the diversity at both local, within stands, and across landscapes. And yet you talked about really big patches. So help me think about that diversity at the landscape scale.
Yeah, I think, it goes to that mosaic, that really what we're trying to achieve with a lot of even fire management or thinning mechanical treatments are creating that mosaic landscape. So small, high severity patches would absolutely increase that understory diversity and allow for more open canopy species to establish in that understory. I think the concern when you get those really large high severity patches is, one is cheatgrass and other species, non-native species invasion. For those of you who've rafted down the Maine salmon or the Middle Fork, it's sad how much cheatgrass is in those systems, and you could tell that they have burned multiple times, and those trees are kind of receding up the hillside. And that's some of the sites that were a part of this study, and I think that's the big concern is if you have these large high severity patches. Again, what I want ultimately, even though I do love trees, is a healthy functioning ecosystem, and I would rather that not just be a healthy functioning cheatgrass system. So I think there's lots that we can do, and that managers should start thinking about more serious in terms of managing those areas that aren't going to be forests again, to be still like healthy native plant communities.
Okay. Eva, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. That's really good to hear, Camille. It kind of makes me feel more hopeful about climate change. That even change can be productive, or it doesn't have to be the disaster that we might have thought of it as. But my question is, so if you're a manager, is there a way to predict which areas are likely to recover, and which areas might be likely to transition to something else? And if they transition to something else, how do you determine, or when do you determine that I think it's better to manage for this alternative system?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways that's really hard to know. You might be at a site, we've all seen that odd ponderosa pine tree that in the middle of grassland, or some in a place that we wouldn't expect it. And so it's hard to say for sure that an ecosystem is going to transition. But there are increasingly more and more really great tree regeneration models that are being established. And there's currently one that is really taking a west-wide focus that the Nature Conservancy and University of Montana is leading to try to understand, or try to, make some really good guidelines for, at least what we've seen so far. You probably shouldn't expect a forest coming back if these are the conditions that you're looking at on a site. So I think those predictive abilities are getting better. And then I think, when you're the manager out there on the ground looking to plant any seedlings, even in a place that's climatically perfect, I think it's still finding those like microsites that are going to be really important for those trees to maintain as that, or to actually survive into the future. So it's a difficult problem, I think, because a lot of what I talked about was much more that broad scale climate influences.
Yeah.
But when you're a baby tree, you don't really care about that, right? You just care about maybe the 6 inches around you as you try to grow your roots down.
Yeah.
So there's lots of scales, and I think in a lot of ways, many silviculturists and revegetation specialists have a lot of knowledge about what works and what didn't. That, I think, was one of the things I was really amazed by in our conversations, of like all the things that they're trying, even in without prompting of how and where trees will survive, especially those kind of more rare or high value trees like white bark pine. Let's try it. We want them on the landscape. Let's see how we can make it happen.
Yeah. So they might plant some, and I guess if they don't grow, then if they die, then it's not going to work there. Or you would need to try a different, maybe genetic stock of the trees.
Yeah, and I think that there's the experimenting. I think there's a lot more, like I said, predictive models. And I think the other thing is that I think in all of this, we're kind of ascribing like our values to these ecosystems, to wanting it to be a certain forest. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's worth, especially if you're not dealing with that kind of competing shrubs like maybe they have in California. I feel like a lot of places in Idaho that wasn't an issue, that to just see what naturally comes back for a couple years at least is kind of a good place to start, because a lot of times we want to right away get trees in the ground. And I know, here in Colorado after this year, I've gotten lots of questions of like, I'm ready to plant, the trees are all dead. And, this year is probably not the best year to start that for many reasons, but it's also, I think, important to see what will naturally happen and where we actually need to intervene.
Yeah.
One of the things we heard from the managers and also from scientists is where you plant within a burned patch. Some people talked about the donut hole, that if you're near the edge, probably tree seeds could get there. So maybe plant and try and establish some more towards the center, or at least further into the patches. So that you get some founder populations that then the forest could gradually recover. So I've heard this question I've heard many times. We know that forests we have a lot more trees, and lots of, like in a ponderosa pine forest, it's become a lot more dense with trees. And probably there's places where, given that fires were much more prevalent in the past, probably there's places that have trees now that didn't have them in the past. Could that be part of the story here?
I think it is to a certain extent, right? Those are two, in some ways we've kind of talked about these two competing ideas. Let's thin the forest because it's too dense, but oh no, now we have a fire and there's no trees and that's bad. Yeah, and I think you know, in some ways, fire is the great equalizer. It's gonna control some of those processes for us in terms of removing those trees that perhaps have moved down into places that they weren't historically. And you know, a lot of these trees that are out there on the landscapes did establish during periods, climatic periods that are really different than what they are now and what they're likely to be into the future. And so I would expect that, you know, even in the absence of fire, that we'd see um, some changes in those ecosystems, whether that's through, you know, drought killed trees, beetle killed trees. Those kind of transitions are happening even without those large fires. Um, I I think the way that we reconcile some of those things goes back to that scale idea, right? If you have a really what we probably didn't see in the past was 18 square miles of a high severity patch anywhere, right? Or very few places. Or like if the fires that happened here in Colorado this year burned over the continental divide, which is pretty crazy. So, you know, you're talking about burning up through alpine meadows above the, you know, above forest tree line. And that probably hasn't happened very often. And so, you know, I think there's a big difference between a 10 or even 100-acre patch of high severity fire that opens up that landscape that may have been in a kind of created that more historic structure of openings and gaps and lower tree density versus, you know, whole landscapes that are, or the whole top of a watershed that's now treeless.
Thanks. One last question. I hear a lot of people debating about climate versus fuels. You know, like could fuel, you've talked a lot about climate, but could fuels management help with patch size or survival of those seed source trees?
Yeah, I think so, definitely, especially on those small scale, you know, or those localized scales. I think even in burn landscapes, there's been an increased discussion about trying to preserve those fire refugia or those, you know, lower severity burn patches within a high severity or within a large wildfire by kind of doing fuels reduction or they call it hardening the edge of those low severity patches. And certainly I think that at some scales and in some forest types, that is how we start to overcome the potential for those high severity fires. I think where it gets tricky is when you talk, you know, that works very well when you talk about these ponderosa pine or lower elevation forests that would have burned more frequently historically. But when you start talking about lodgepole or spruce and fir forests, those forests have always burned at high intensity and have always had an abundant amount of fuel, you know, and you can go in there and thin, but that's not going to necessarily increase the number of trees that survive because they're not fire tolerant. And it's not really a good idea from an ecological perspective because that's not how those forests have been for millennia. And in those cases, I think we're starting to get it's the issue is that those were once climate limited, meaning that the climate was limiting fire because there was always an abundant amount of fuel. And if we, as the climate warms, we're going to have all that fuel becomes available to burn since it's not under snow anymore for most of the year. So I think it really, you know, as the classic ecologist as me would say, is that it depends. And in this case, I think it really depends on the forest type you're talking about.
Okay. Well, thank you, Camille. I am so impressed. I don't know how many people looking at this would realize that's a picture of you.
It is, yes.
That you draw upon your experience as working on hotshot crews and on so many field sites where you've been out on the ground. And then at the same time, you're so capable of communicating clearly And so I'm heartened that you're one of the people leading the fire science and its application well into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There's nothing more nerve-wracking than giving a presentation to two people who are on your PhD committee again.
Okay, then. Thank you, Eva, for recording, and Camille, and we'll look forward to sharing this on the website.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so
Bye-bye.
bye, ladies.